What's next? This is the question that has been raised by many after the success of the Backrooms. Not just what's next for the canon itself, but what's next for modern cinema. The Backrooms being A24's highest grossing film was no fluke. As I'm assuming all of you already know, The Backrooms was a very popular web series from a few years ago, so when it was adapted, the film already had a lot of fans who would be eager to see it. The answer to the question of what's next is pretty simple upon first glance. Companies and producers will find other web series similar to The Backrooms and attempt to adapt them to the big screen. It's already happening right now, actually. The next web series in talks of development is none other than the Mandela Catalogue. But the Mandela Catalogue is different from The Backrooms.
How can you sit there and eat pizza?
You know the word unfilmable. I won't pretend that you don't know this word. A point that I would like to raise that you might not have thought about is that books and literature are not the only things that can be considered unfilmable. You might have heard that Dune was unfilmable at one point for it being far too dense to be adapted to a screenplay. Maybe you've heard of Blood Meridian and how that movie remains unfilmable for its dense, cinematic prose and its violence. Maybe the Odyssey or the Iliad for being better fit to written text or spoken word and for being dense. The reason unfilmable is almost exclusively used to describe novels is because nothing else really fits to be adapted to a film. Other works of art, like painting, could potentially inspire certain cinematic shots in movies or certain compositions, but when it comes to adaptation, the most common form of adapting is from a book or a poem to a movie or a TV show. But with the rise of web series, there's another medium that's also fit for adaptation. There are many different types of web series that exist, but I wanted to focus on analog horror, a genre that both the Backrooms and the Mandela Catalogue fall into, yet I personally consider one to be unfilmable, the Mandela Catalogue. But first, why was the Backrooms so seamlessly adaptable into film? Let's get one thing straight. Adapting a web series into film is vastly different from adapting a book or a poem. Though I can only really use the Backrooms as an example, or as a main example, for the former, it is still a fair comparison. Adapting a web series to a film is much more of an expansion. Certain things from the Backrooms web series were compromised when adapting the film, like the atmosphere that analog horror allows, but many things were expanded upon or reinterpreted, like the lore being expanded and refined, and the plot being less of an adaptation and more of a story set in the universe that Parsons created. Whereas a book adapted into film, like Dune for example, is always a direct translation of a pre-existing plot, usually partially reimagined or interpreted based on the filmmakers, and almost always at a significant sacrifice to the original plot. Even though Villeneuve's Dune movies adapted one book into 2 movies, many things were changed and a lot of plot points were made more concise or discarded altogether. The riddance of plot points does not come from a distaste towards the story beats themselves, but more so from a necessity as a filmmaker to trim parts of it down. So, with this being said, the Backrooms certainly had interesting lore, but not so expansive that any adaptation would sacrifice any of it. The lore was not super restrictive in terms of how he could approach writing and directing the film. Another reason that the Backrooms was seamlessly adapted, in my opinion, is the actual content of the original web series. Analog horror is a very odd and interesting form of horror, predominantly made on the internet. It uses fake broadcasting on old VHS-style tapes, found footage-esque elements, and other creative methods of storytelling. Some mainstream films have used these techniques, like the Blair Witch Project, but with the more restrictive nature of full-scale films, it is often agreed that this genre flourishes by independent online filmmakers. These elements that are included in analog horror are usually so wacky and bizarre and specific to the medium that it would seem hard to adapt to film in the same way that this story is portrayed online. The Backrooms is somewhat different from the rest though. While it does use odd and wacky elements like public service announcements and broadcast-style storytelling techniques, the root of it, and pretty much the entirety of the first entry into the web series, relies on first-person camcorder footage. This creates atmosphere using elements of analog horror, but also elements of cinematography, despite being stylized like a handheld camera. Most of what made the Backrooms web series so interesting was exactly this. While most analog horror relied solely on aforementioned elements, which is not a bad thing, The visuals of the Backrooms created an arguably more immersive version of analog horror, or at least a different form of it. Since the visuals were so prominent, adapting it to screen was no difficult feat, at least no more than it needed to be, and the actual film even uses a fair amount of camcorder footage. The Mandela Catalogue is much different from the Backrooms. While from an outsider's perspective, like Steven Spielberg's Amblin trying to find a way to capitalize off of the success of the Backrooms, they might be categorized as the same, but the way they utilize the medium is uniquely different. The main horror of the Mandela Catalogue comes not just from found footage-esque clips, but also old VHS broadcasts and creepy imagery. It relies much less on grounded visuals and more on a series of loosely connected pieces of information, all strung together, like brief clips of footage, broadcasts, phone calls, etc. This would make the film adaptation of the Mandela Catalogue much less seamless than the Backrooms. The Mandela Catalogue's visual style comes directly from its unique storytelling, but the Backrooms' visual style is prominent on its own, and it just so happens that it is communicated via found footage-esque storytelling. Another potential problem is that the lore and story of the Mandela Catalogue is, in my opinion, much more restrictive than the Backrooms. I won't go into spoilers, but the Mandela Catalogue has a much more expansive lore than Kane Parsons' version of the Backrooms, and it follows a more coherent plot than the Backrooms web series, which might seem like it would lend itself to film better, but in my opinion, it simply wouldn't. Having a more restrictive plot with an already specific method of storytelling that would have to be drastically changed upon adaptation means communicating the plot like a regular movie would be very difficult and less impactful. And the thing that made the Mandela Catalogue so unique and interesting was not just the concept, but how the story was told. So if you change how the story was told, it loses its luster in a way. The actual idea of the Mandela Catalogue, that is, an invasion of basically demons that try to imitate humans, is a very interesting concept on its own and could certainly turn into a big film, but the specific way the Mandela Catalogue tells its story would never truly be able to be adapted to film. You could say the same thing about the Backrooms, but the actual lore and story is much more loose with the Backrooms. The main appeal to the Backrooms was the liminal aesthetic and interesting and vague lore, but the main intrigue with the Mandela Catalogue is more about how the story is told. The horror is communicated in a hyper-specific way, using image and audio distortion, specific footage, and broadcasts, whereas Backrooms lends itself better to being adapted in different ways. So, the Mandela Catalogue is not necessarily completely unfilmable as a concept, but the actual hype around it and the thing that makes it scary for myself and many others simply cannot be translated to the screen. Just like how the upcoming Odyssey might be an exceptionally well movie, but it might never match the prose and poetry that the original work offers. When anything is adapted to the screen, some things are sacrificed. No matter what. The Backrooms is no different. The real question is that which is sacrificed worth it to turn it into a film? For the Mandela Catalogue, I would say maybe, but if it ever would get adapted, it wouldn't feel like the same story as the original web series, whereas the Backrooms did. I apologize to all my Peak Stasis fans who waited 10 months for a new upload. I'm hoping I can get back to making videos like usual, so stay tuned. If you disagree with any points or hate me, or if you agree with certain parts, let me know in the comments, and I'm happy to reply to all of them. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you all in the next Peak Stasis video.